clear that the intention of today's debate is much more forward-looking, so not too much about Darfur, Sudan in the past or in the present, but in particular about the potentialities and limitations of international peacekeeping and Europe's role in it. So I'd like to devote part of my time to Sudan, Darfur as a case, and then go into more general potentialities and limitations. I make speeches about Sudan, Darfur all over the place. Mostly I start off by asking the general question, what went wrong, when, why, and who is responsible. And then I start off right away with the answer. Everything went wrong right from the beginning and everybody is responsible. Which is important because it does show some of the limitations, complexities of the implementation of the principle of the responsibility or the duty to protect, and also the limitations of international peacekeeping. Very briefly about Darfur itself. The present situation is extremely bleak. There is no peace for the people who have been evicted from the villages and their houses, whether it was genocide or ethnic cleansing, and I'm not going into that debate now in the first half an hour. That can be discussed later on. There is no perspective. The humanitarian operation is the one which has had a lot of success. Thousands young people from Europe, US, Canada, Australia, together with, don't forget, about 10,000 Sudanese national staff members, helping out 2+ million IDPs, displaced people, and refugees throughout Darfur and also across the border in Chad. Without them, it would not be possible. The UN, we were facilitating it, organizing it, defending it against, for instance, the government of Sudan, but they did the job in an extremely difficult, tight situation. Being financed, I'm not going to pester you with figures, but some figures are necessary. Being financed with about $800 million per annum. Together with $700 million per annum, which still are necessary for the humanitarian operation in South Sudan. Don't forget, a 50 years war, 10 years break in the 70s, leading to 2+ million victims. It finally leads to a peace agreement, Nairobi, January 2005, which created a perspective for the people in the south, which was highly necessary because nothing had been done in South Sudan. It was empty. It was empty in terms of any development initiative in that country. It's the poorest part of Africa. And there's a link, I will come back to that later, between the two conflicts, North-South Sudan and also Darfur. We still need a lot of assistance also for South Sudan. Together, the two humanitarian operations, Darfur, South Sudan, are the two biggest by the international community in the world as a whole, annually $1.5 billion. On top of that, $1 billion for a peacekeeping operation in Sudan, which is each year $2.5 million necessary in order to just to keep the whole operation going without a political perspective, just to keep it going. But the humanitarian operation anyway did lead and is still leading in Darfur to saving people's lives. With the help of all these people who are going over it, saving people's lives. And in terms of, for instance, malnutrition, child malnutrition, and also child mortality rates, the situation has improved tremendously in about 1 or 2 years from 2003 until 2005. Extremely vulnerable because these people are only being kept alive with a reasonable level of living in terms of those indicators because of the assistance from outside, which is of course not food security at all. It is just security on the basis of a shoestrap getting from outside. And the security is, of course, very lax, because as soon as these operations, humanitarian operations, are being hampered by, for instance, road bombs or bandits or just harassment by the authorities in Sudan, and the people in the camps are extremely vulnerable. There's always a couple of weeks food enough present between different lifestyles, farmer settlers, nomads, cattle, overpopulation in people and cattle on a ground territory which is getting more and more scarce in terms of the possibility to feed people and cattle, also because of climate change. And you see the whole battle of that whole area in Africa, from Dakar to Port Sudan, more or less plagued by the same ecological, economic problem. In some parts it is more violent than other parts, but the structural characteristic is everywhere the same. And what we have seen in Darfur, what we are seeing in Darfur, we see also some other parts of that belt, and it will continue. But of course there are other reasons as well. There is a political reason. The people in Darfur feel neglected and oppressed by the elites and the regime in Khartoum. Historical political reasons, because Darfur in the past was Sudan, and there was always a fight between that part of Sudan, which had a great history in the last couple of centuries, and Sudan as a whole. There's also a racist element, Arab, African. There is also a tribal connection. There are huge fights between the tribes, always have been in that part of the world. It is complex. Political, economic, cultural, ecological, in all its variety. At a certain moment, of course, in such situations, people start to revolt. It happens. The conflict, of course, did not start in 2003, but the escalation of the conflict into violence erupted in 2003, and the government was reacting unwisely by not using that much the army. It is to a certain extent rather disciplined in Sudan, but using the Arab militia, which are not disciplined at all, they just kill. And they knew that, because they had done exactly the same in the 1980s against the SPLA, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army in the south. When the army was unable to resist the SPLA, the Arab militia were brought in and they were just killing people in villages. And there was always a kind of coalition between the army and the air force and the Arab militia. The planes got in, Antonov, bombing, terrorizing, intimidating the people on the ground, fleeing out of the villages, hardly towns, very small villages, very easily to be attacked. And then the militia came in on horseback and on camel, killing dozens and chasing away the others and telling them never come back, this is our territory from now onwards. To a great extent it was ethnic, tribal, ethnic cleansing for survival reasons, for an economic lifestyle. Complex and extremely cruel. The government was responsible by reacting like this, by allowing this to continue or by feeding it. And the international community was responsible by neglect. UN staff members, non-governmental organizations, humanitarians and others in 2003 asked the members of the Security Council, please put Darfur on the agenda of the Security Council, and they didn't do it. There may have been several reasons. We can continue to discuss that. It's not for now, maybe for the discussion. Anyway, they didn't do it. So, the genocide, if there was genocide, legal problem, or cleansing, or anyway the mass murder, continued while the international community knew what was happening and refused to put this on the agenda of the body which did have to take the instruments which the international community had given itself in the whole process of the 1990s to carry out humanitarian intervention or to implement principles such as human security or the duty or responsibility to protect. We were closing our internationally. And only until we did have 1.5 million people in the camps, and maybe already at that time, nobody knew exactly, 200,000 people being killed, that the Security Council took the decision to give a mandate, an additional mandate to the UN mission, which I was leading, just since a couple of weeks earlier, also to discuss with the authorities to politically facilitate a solution for Darfur, without any additional dollar, without any additional staff member, let alone, of course, a peacekeeper, nothing. So we just stayed on in a humanitarian operation, facilitating that, organizing a little bit the security of that humanitarian operation, participating then also on the ground in the political debate. So the international community continued to wait and see, but to one other decision, 2 months later, in September 2004, to request the African Union to step in with a peacekeeping force which would enlarge the existing group of ceasefire monitors. There had been a ceasefire which was violated right from the beginning, which was monitored, which was not very effectively by the African Union. Bring in also peacekeepers. That's what they did. They brought in peacekeepers, African Union forces from a number of countries, and they were promised adequate financial and other resources in order to do the job. That promise was not kept. So they, from the very beginning, had to deal with very scarce resources. They got money, but not enough. They got money, but for another 2 or 3 months they had to beg around in the world again, please give us more money so that we can pay wages. And in the end, we were working with African Union forces which were not paid, which started to mutiny against their own officers. We did not have fuel to go around Darfur in order to show their presence and to deter possible attacks on people in villages by the Arab militia or by the government. African Union did a very good job in the beginning, but became completely disillusioned later on. Also on the basis of a lack of resources, whereby in the international debate everybody would say, you're not doing a good job. It meant that people started to run also against the international community. And it became a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in the end, they were much less effective than in the beginning. But they were basically very good. And I was always in Darfur, I was asking commanders of the African Union, is this your first job here? Sir, come on. I was in Bosnia, I was in Timor, I was in Angola, I was in Sierra Leone, this is my 5th job already. Now, as a commander of an African Union, but I was in the UN. In principle, they are as good as any other peace force. Maybe even better, because they know the culture, they know the situation, they are also willing to take more risks than Western peacekeepers would be willing to do in the African situation. So they're good in itself, but they just didn't get the adequate resources. We got negotiations to get peace in Darfur. And finally, the negotiations did lead to an agreement, which was to a great extent also fabricated by outside intervention in political terms, putting pressure on parties to reach a compromise, and the pressure was not well carried out, because we got an agreement against what was necessary between the government and one party, one rebel movement. The wrong one, moreover. And it should have been an agreement with all the rebel movements, because the government of Sudan is extremely clever. Throughout all these movements, processes, they always have been able to divide and rule. They're very clever. They are Machiavellian. They know to split their adversaries. They had done that in the East with the Baja and the Rashida movements. They had done it in the South. When SPLA got stronger, they just wiped a number of leaders and tribal leaders out of SPLA, giving them jobs and positions in Khartoum, weakening the opposition. They are extremely clever in also manipulating the international community. And that peace agreement, the Darfur peace agreement, was meant to catalyze process towards peace, became a further splitting device in Darfur, whereby also the international community made a major mistake, saying to those who had taken the political decision, because you're negotiating, and that means that you are participating in a political process, who had taken the political decision not to accept the political outcome, not signing the agreement, that these people were outlaws, that these people were terrorists, which gave an additional argument, reason, legitimate reason in their view to the government to fight the rebels whom they had negotiated but which had not accepted the outcome of the negotiation, or not yet, because they said it doesn't satisfy our expectation or the expectations of our people. And the government came stronger out of the talks than before, because they had sidelined in their own circles one of the rebel movements, becoming part of the government forces, because the leader became the main advisor on Darfur of President Bashir, and the other group was still the group to be attacked. And they said, you have said it yourself, international community, because they are outlaws. And when they continued those attacks, very sophisticated, because they had to disarm the Arab militia, the Janjaweed, they promised to do so. They didn't keep the promise. They brought them in, the army, and in the Popular Defense Force, which is the official paramilitary force. They had their alternative shadow disarmament program. They took away their arms, so they gave them better ones, in order to ask them to do the job for the army and fight the rebels more effectively than their force. And they continue to bomb against, of course, the demands of the Security Council, but they have been able to violate all the demands of the Security Council since the first resolution was passed on Darfur. They continue to bomb, and they did exactly what had been done before. Bombing, militia coming in on the remaining villages with fighters on camel and horseback. The present situation is even more chaotic than before. It is extremely difficult. As a matter of fact, the government won the political process. And they made very clear to the international community, we've signed an agreement, but still we continue to seek a military solution. And they are getting away with it because there is not enough international action to curtail their possibilities to do so. I have some views on what should be done on Darfur, Sudan in the future. I'm not going to discuss that here. Could be done in the discussion. This picture should be seen as a kind of a case for future policies with regard to the implementation of the idea of the duty to protect, the implementation of peacekeeping operations. A number of suggestions I would like to make. First important thing is that there is no general model. It is very important to understand the specificity of the local or national situation. All conflicts, and there are many conflicts in Africa, Middle East and Asia, are very specific for the country concerned. When you have a strong country with a lot of power, it's different from a weak country, such as with a weak regime, such as Liberia or Sierra Leone. When you have an economic conflict or resources conflict, it is different from a situation in which, for instance, the major differences are of a subnational regional character or of a culture and religious character. It's extremely important to define a strategy on the basis of a specific knowledge, analysis of the root causes of the conflict in itself. No uniform approach. In developmental policy making, we have always criticized the International Monetary Fund. One overall uniform model to deal with all problems of adjustment or non-adjustment in third world countries. Of course, that never does work, and that was clear from the practice. At the moment, we are dealing with an overall policy with regards to peacekeeping, which is also rather uniform. It's a choice between two things. Either not to do anything, which is for Sudan the case, because the only thing which the Security Council has done so far on Darfur is passing resolutions, making statements, press releases, in those resolutions defining demands, the result of negotiations on the basis of a lowest common denominator between the Big Five in the Security Council, then being confronted with the violation of all these demands by the party in power, and then passing a new resolution, or asking for a new report, or sending a new investigative mission of no action. One. And the second possibility, it's black or white, is speaking about sending a peacekeeping force. But if there is no peace, peacekeeping force does not make sense, because it is peacekeeping. We are not discussing peacemaking. Peacemaking in a strong country is out of the question. Peacemaking with a peace force from outside is hardly possible. Moreover, after Iraq, it is politically hardly possible, because there was a peacekeeping force, peacemaking force, which was sent outside the realm of the United Nations, with negating the view of the members of the Security Council itself. And after Iraq, it is hardly possible at the moment to reach any decision in the Security Council on a consensus basis with regard to UN Security Council consensus-based peacemaking. One of the biggest problems of the intervention in Iraq is not only the present chaos in Iraq itself, but the erosion of the possibility of the international system, the international legal system of the United Nations, to be effective in terms of the implementation of its own values. And that political context has to be taken into consideration if we discuss the implementation of the values which are so important of the United Nations system. So be very specific in defining what you do, by in particular also applying all types of possibilities somewhere in between not doing anything or sending in a peace force, and take into consideration that sending in a peace force at the moment is hardly possible anymore, given the present political situation in the world. I come back to that. I also will come back to what could be done in between. Third point. There are three possibilities in particular, in principle, with regards to peace forces. Chapter 6 of the Charter of the United Nations, Chapter 7, Chapter 8. I'm going to explain. Chapter 6 of the Charter of the United Nations implies we're sending in a peacekeeping keeping false, upon the invitation of the parties which have invited the United Nations to do so, in order to help them, us parties, to keep our own peace. Because we have fought, we have ceasefire, we have a peace agreement, there is not a ceasefire, now that ceasefire, then that peace has to be kept. We want to do that ourselves because we are truly believing in our own peace. However, we have to be helped because all ceasefire, all ways are being violated. Help us. Two instruments are necessary. An international peace clause to help the parties to keep the peace, to stay within the areas which have been determined in the peacekeeping agreement, for instance, and to have a ceasefire committee which addresses all claims that violations of that agreement are taking place. That's what we do in the south of Sudan. There we are with 10,000 peacekeepers from many different countries in order to help the SPLA, South, and the government in South Sudan to keep their peace. And there are, of course, violations. And there is conflict, communal conflict, which very easily can develop into a political conflict. But we have been able so far, and I keep my fingers crossed as far as the future is concerned, but that may be for the discussion, we have been able to contain all violent conflict, to keep it under control and to prevent escalation in an irreversible manner, or to prevent those conflicts to flow across borders within South Sudan. But we are there on the basis of the invitation of the parties. And we are leading a ceasefire committee, which is meeting each 2 weeks, where all violations can be raised, either by the parties against each other, that are taking place, or by the UN, which is leading the ceasefire committee. And as soon as something is taking place, it's on the table, and we, the UN, the force commander, can decide this is the reaction. We can even, that's what we decided, we can even tell parties to retreat from a specific area. We can give that decision. Because we were invited by the parties to do so. In Darfur, it's not possible to have a peacekeeping operation on the basis of Chapter 6 for 2 reasons. First, the 2 parties didn't invite us. The government didn't want it. And the rebels, which were of course not complete on the other side of the table, didn't push for it. And the UK and the US didn't want the UN to push for a Chapter 6 operation in the Abuja agreement. We do not want to have a discussion in that agreement of a peacekeeping force of the United Nations. So our hands were tied. Chapter 6 is a good option if indeed, during a negotiation, parties finally agree that the only way to keep their own peace sustainable for quite some time is by inviting an international credible peace force. The second possibility is Chapter 7. We get in anyway, whether you like it or not. Which has been done by the UN in weak countries, such as, for instance, Liberia and Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, not exactly, but you get in, or you force the parties to ask, which is somewhere between 6. And so there is no other option for you than just to ask us otherwise. Yeah? That is a possibility. And that works. When you get in with force, you can do the job. But you can only do so if you have unanimity amongst the big forces, the big countries in the Security Council, the permanent 5. UK, US, France, China, Russia, and then the others also. You would need a majority anyway, but including all 5. You never get, for Sudan, unanimity between the P5. Never. That's a political fact, it's a political analysis, we will not get it. And the Security Council only discussing this, or not doing anything but just passing resolutions, did paralyze itself. We're constantly discussing a peacekeeping force, the United Nations. We would never be invited, and we would never in the Security Council get a consensus on it. So we have wasted a lot of time. Of course, there are also implementation problems as far as such a peace force is concerned, if there would be some acceptance. Because Western countries do not want to go to Africa, number one. And none of the Western countries which were pleading for a United Nations peace force has ever offered forces to do that. But you could, of course, ask others to do the job, and you can go even further by a Chapter 8 operation, and that means the following. Will UN finance an operation by somebody else? Fully. Not just on a shoestring. Not just for a couple of months. But fully. Fully. Adequate. The African Union, for instance, will do the job for the UN. But then the Security Council decides the mandate, decides the exit strategy, when you have to leave, and pays fully for it. Then it could be done. If the African Union could do the job. At the moment, I'm speaking about a hypothetical situation, because at the moment there is no possibility that such a decision is going to be made. But in similar situations, the UN could use Chapter 8 much better than it ever has been done. For fact, the UN administration never wants to discuss Chapter 8. The UN wants to do it themselves, and they cannot do that at the moment because the UN also doesn't have the troops available. If there is a resolution, if there would be a resolution by the Security Council to go for a peacekeeping operation, the Secretary General of the United Nations has to beg around in the world, please give me the troops. And then many countries are just thinking about it. And very often it will take half a year or longer before you have the troops. When I was sent to lead the peacekeeping mission to Sudan, and I got my mandate to lead a peace force of 10,000 in South Sudan, which was a mandate already half a year before the peace agreement would be signed, so everybody could prepare. It took us more than a year after the agreement had been signed before I had my 10,000 peacekeepers, which was, of course, extremely difficult. The UN is also perhaps nearly at the end of its own capacity, not only politically, but also in terms of physical capacity to do it themselves. And that is another reason to take the Chapter 8 operation much more seriously. Next point, and I will be brief. It will be necessary for such a force, always in practical situations, to be robust. Now, robust has to be defined. For me, it means the following. It should be strong enough and big enough to deter everything. And to protect not only people in camps, but also later when people return home. Because in Darfur, for instance, these 2+ million people will have to get home. To protect them in a camp is not enough. They want to go home only if their security is being guaranteed. And you have to do that in the present situation. They still can be attacked and are being attacked by militia with a peacekeeping force. They should be big enough. So thinking of 7,000 in such a huge area is not enough. There are many military views about minimum numbers which are necessary. And I've hardly met any military expert, for instance NATO, who was using a figure below the 20,000. And that is extremely difficult for that situation, because African countries cannot bring about 20,000 and Western countries have not offered anything. But anyway, it should be credible, and that means big enough and strong enough. And long enough staying. You cannot just get in there for a while and leave, because then the party. You have to be there as long as necessary, also in order to bring the political process closer to some form of lasting peace and reconciliation, so that not everything is going to start all over again. And that requires, of course, also financial guarantees for, say, 7 years. And that is a tall order. Peacekeeping is not a cheap option. It is relatively cheap because war, also in terms of the numbers of victims, is much more expensive. Finally, my last one. In a situation such as Sudan, international peacekeeping is extremely difficult, also because of the international context. Do not underestimate, and that has been underestimated to a very great extent by all types of NGOs and commentators from the sideline, the international climate, which is a climate whereby people in Arab or half Arab, Islamic or half Islamic countries see all this as an attack on the Arab Islamic world. The people in Sudan, of course, they have been also manipulated by their leaders. See, even if they don't agree with their own leaders, any talk about the UN coming to Sudan as the next theater in the world after Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine in particular. You're coming after us. And then they all of a sudden forget the atrocities of their own regime because they are going to be attacked by the UN. And when we tell them, and I have done that, day after day, the UN is not the US. The UN is you, Sudan, plus 200 other countries. They don't believe that anymore. At the moment we are in a kind of a political, cultural collision. And even in the new Human Rights Council in Geneva, whereby atrocities of human rights violations are being raised in Darfur, and they are very clear, because there is mass rape and mass killing has taken place, and it has not stopped. We don't get a fair agreement anymore behind a majority resolution blaming those who are the perpetrators. There is a political climate in the world whereby also the UN is being seen by many, say, young people in the Middle East and in these parts of Africa as the adversary, rather than as protecting themselves, their people, their friends, and their families. And that requires reform of the UN. The implementation of the duty and responsibility to protect, and possibilities to carry out some humanitarian intervention in an effective manner, not by becoming part of the problem rather than being part of the solution, requires a reform of the UN system, of the Security Council in particular, leading to a situation whereby, if such decisions are being made, it's being seen all over the world, including by people in those countries, as something which is representing also their values and their objectives. And that at the moment is not the case. So the duty to protect and humanitarian intervention is extremely necessary in order to protect potential victims of atrocities. But we have to change the very system which was created in the 1940s in order to start this process. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, James, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me to this extremely important debate this evening. What I want to do with the time that is allotted to me is really three things. Firstly, I want to locate our discussion this evening around peace, conflict and civilian protection in Africa within the framework of the responsibility to protect concept. Now, that's something that Jan Pronk referred to in his remarks. It may be a concept that some of you are familiar with, but maybe not all of you are familiar with it, and I think it's an extremely important and defining concept. Now, I'd like to explain a little bit what it is and where it came from and how our current discussion locates itself within that framework. Secondly, I want to say a little bit about what I think should happen in relation to Darfur at the moment. I know that Jan Pronk will say more about that in the discussion, but this is clearly not a conflict that's gone away. In some senses, the conflict is worse today than it has been since the start start of the conflict in 2003, and I'd like to say a little bit about what I think the options are for the international community in addressing it. And then thirdly, I want to draw some broader lessons from that crisis and possibly from other crises that we can then try and apply in future Darfur-like situations in other parts of the continent. And I'll focus my remarks very much on Africa this evening. So to start with the responsibility to protect, many of you will know that in September 2005, at the 60th anniversary of the UN that met in New York, the world community, all the governments of the world, I think without exception, endorsed a responsibility to protect. What does that mean? It means that in situations in which there are war crimes taking place, in which there is genocide, in which mass killing is occurring, and where the government locally is either responsible for that killing or is unable or unwilling to stop it, that the obligation to do something about it becomes a collective global obligation. A critically important norm that the world has endorsed through its voting of that particular UN resolution. Where does that concept come from? Obviously the debate about humanitarian intervention in some senses is as old as the international state system is old. So for 300 plus years people have been intervening in other countries and sort of claiming that they were doing it for humanitarian, however cynical those arguments may have been. But the contemporary debate about humanitarian intervention is really a post-Cold War phenomenon. It's really the end of the Cold War, the demise of the Soviet Union in the start of the 1990s that triggered a deeper and more intensified debate about what our collective obligations are in these kind of cases. And I think there are a number of crises and conflicts in the 1990s that were particularly significant in shaping people's thinking about these questions. The critical one was Rwanda in 1994, a crisis that Jan Pronk is very familiar with and you will be very familiar with, but that was the crisis in which literally 800,000 people died, the small UN presence that was in the country was withdrawn, the world community knew what was happening but chose not to act. And critically and interestingly, Kofi Annan was the head of UN peacekeeping at the time. And while there have been criticisms made of his particular performance in that role, I think he was personally extremely touched and affected by that experience. And one of the things that led him to think very profoundly in the course of the 90s about what the collective obligation ought to be in these kind of cases. The other example was profoundly influential and impactful was the Bosnian crisis. Effectively, in Bosnia and then in Kosovo, the whole Balkan conflict was another crisis that led people to think that it simply wasn't acceptable any longer to say that what went on within national territory was simply a sovereign concern of that country and there wasn't any wider collective global obligation. And it was Kofi Annan in a very influential speech in 2000 who posed this question in saying, if humanitarian intervention really is such an unacceptable breach of national sovereignty, what are we to do about a Rwanda or a Srebrenica that offends every precept of our common humanity? He posed the question, he asked people to think intelligently about what might be done about it. And to their credit, the government of Canada in the year 2000 established what was called the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. It was co-chaired by Gareth Evans, who is now the head of the International Crisis Group, who was previously Australian Foreign Minister, and Mohamed Sarnoun, who was a distinguished African diplomat. And the two people with a panel of 12 members of the Commission really tried to address the question that Annan posed. What are our responsibilities in these kind of extreme cases? Not in dealing with, if you like, regular human rights abuse, of which there is all far too much in so many countries around the world, but these exceptional cases, war crimes, crimes against humanity, mass killing, in those settings, what are the options and what are the obligations of the broader international community? And this ISIS Commission, as it's called, the ICISS Commission, produced its report in 2001, and I think it had a number of very important things to say. The first was that it chose to reconceptualise the notion of sovereignty. Traditionally, sovereignty has been, and perhaps for some people still is, the notion of a kind of exclusive jurisdictional, legal, political space where the government can pretty much do what it likes within that space and that territory. And what the Commission said was that sovereignty as control needs to be replaced by the notion of sovereignty as responsibility. There are obligations that a sovereign government has towards its own population, and if it doesn't discharge them, and if it breaches those obligations, then there's a kind of common global interest that needs to be brought into play. The other thing that the Commission did, which was extremely important, was to break down this broad notion of the responsibility to protect into three specific responsibilities: to prevent, to react, and to rebuild. And it said that the responsibility to prevent was actually the most important of all three, because if we can be more effective about preventing crises and conflict, there is less demand, less resource, less obligation to react further down the line, and often the conflicts are much more complex to deal with. So that was the sort of framework that the Commission set out. It's a framework that's actually achieved a huge amount of buy-in and acceptance by the global community, culminating in this endorsement by the world's governments in 2005. So there's been huge normative progress. People buying into this notion that we do have this collective responsibility to protect, but as we know from the debate, and we know from Jan Pronk's remarks this evening, there's a huge gap between the theory and the kind of statements that people make in UN resolutions and the practice on the ground. And the clearest, starkest illustration of the gap between theory and practice is Darfur. It's not the only example, but it's, at the moment, the clearest instance of where governments' rhetorical statements are not matched by serious commitment and action on the ground. So what do we do about Darfur today? It seems to me there are two essential things that need to be done. The first is a much more intensified effort, collective international effort to get a peace process moving again. Huge efforts have been invested in trying to make that happen in the past, but there is no permanent resolution or settlement to this problem without some kind of political solution. More energy needs to be devoted to that. And the second is to get some kind of international force deployed in Darfur. Now that may be a UN force or it may be a UN-AU hybrid force, but it seems to me essential that a larger, better equipped, better mandated, better resourced force is deployed in Darfur if the civilians that are suffering to an extraordinary extent at the moment are to get the kind of protection that they need. So how is that going to happen? Now it seems to me on this debate about how you persuade the Sudanese government to change its position, you've got a kind of spectrum of views. On the one hand, you've got people who say we need to work very closely with the Sudanese government, be quite conciliatory, really try and persuade them to do something differently. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who say, well, basically military force is all they understand. And my own position is somewhere in the middle. I believe that we do need a more coercive approach than we've used to date. I agree with Jan Pronk, and I think probably with a broad international consensus of opinion on these things, that a non-consensual military intervention in Darfur will be a disaster. I don't see any way in which it could be done feasibly without actually making the situation worse rather than better. And of the various criteria that the ISIS Commission set out for military intervention, one of the most important is if it's going to make things worse rather than better, don't do it. And I think in the case of Darfur today, because of the size of the country, because of some of the factors that Jan Pronk referred to, non-consensual military deployment is not an option. But I do think there is considerable scope for the global community to use the other instruments at its disposal more effectively than it's done to date. And I would single out the role of sanctions and the role of legal instruments. It seems to me surprising that despite all the rhetoric that comes out of European governments about Darfur, we get some extremely strong statements from European governments about the appalling situation there, but that's not been matched to date by really serious economic pressure on the government of Khartoum. Now, sanctions are different from military force. Military force, to be legal, has to be authorised by the UN Security Council. Sanctions don't have to be. Obviously, it would be preferable for sanctions to have UN authority, but there is scope for governments to take sanctions independently if UN authorisation, UN support for that can't be achieved. And it seems to me that the Americans already have sanctions on Khartoum, that there is scope for the Europeans to look at issues around asset freezes, travel bans, financial sanctions, looking at the way in which European companies may be working with the Sudanese oil industry. This is a country which is extraordinarily dependent on oil, to give us some more leverage, some more traction with the Khartoum government, to get it to be both more flexible when it comes to the peace process with the rebel groups, and then also needs to be worked with the rebel groups to make them less fractured and more constructive than they've been in the past, but also to get them to consent to the deployment of a UN or a UN-AU hybrid force. And this was something that Jan Pronk referred to in his remarks. It may sound slightly odd to say we need to force them to consent to a force being deployed, but there are precedents for this. And perhaps the best precedent that I can cite is Indonesia in 1999, where actually serious international pressure on the government of Indonesia in relation to the conflict in East Timor got them to consent to a force being deployed in that territory. And I think there is scope for us to do something similar with Sudan. I think the other thing I would say about sanctions in Sudan is that there is evidence that from previous history, relatively recent history in relation to Sudan, that pressure and sanctions could work. I mean, people forget that it wasn't so long ago that Osama bin Laden actually had a base in Khartoum. He was invited in by the Khartoum government, the NCP government, and he was a resident in Sudan. And serious political pressure, particularly by the Americans actually, got the Khartoum government to judge that actually its calculation of interest is it wasn't good having this guy in the country, and they expelled him. They asked him to leave. And then similarly in relation to the North-South peace agreement, there were many complex reasons that led to that deal, as Jan Pronk says, after 50 years of a very protracted civil war. But I think political pressure played a part in it, and I think there is scope for applying political pressure, economic pressure, and legal pressure through the ICC and other instruments to get more flexibility in relation to the conflict that we've seen to date. Let me move on to my third broad set of points, which is really the lessons that we might draw from the Darfur conflict that we can apply more broadly to some of the other issues that we'll discuss this evening. I've got 6 lessons, and I'll speak very briefly about each. The first is the importance of acting early. This was something the ISIS Commission report said. I suspect it's something that Jan Pronk, as someone who's been deeply involved in these things, would concur with, that if you can act early and decisively, your chances of dealing with the situation effectively are much enhanced. There's no guarantee. I'm not saying there's a kind of magic wand about this, but if after 3 or 4 years of conflict, when there's been extraordinary polarisation, large-scale killing on both sides, your chances of resolving a conflict then are much more complex, much harder, and much more resource-intensive than acting decisively early. So let's prioritise preventative actions to a greater extent than we're doing at the moment. The second point is about strengthening African capacity, and I say strengthen African capacity, but I have a kind of sub-clause, if you like. But let's try and strengthen Africa's capacity to deal with these conflicts more effectively. But don't let's set the African Union unrealistic expectations or make unrealistic demands on what it can achieve. And don't let's say, in this slogan, African solutions for African problems, that somehow that absolves the rest of us of any responsibility. And of course, just as we want Europe to take more responsibility for Europe's problems, we want Africa to take more responsibility for Africa's problems. But Africa is a poor continent, it's a continent with weak structures of governance, with fragile institutions, and it's going to need a lot of help and support. And yes, we want Africa to try and lead on these things, but let's not pretend that Africa can do it on its own without substantial external support, particularly by the Europeans, whether that be financial, or technical, or other kinds of assistance. The third point is to recognise that this responsibility to protect is a collective global obligation. And we talk a lot about what we should do, what Europe should do, or what America should do. But what about what the Chinese should do, or what the Russians should do, or what the Arab League should do? And if we think about Darfur, the record of all 3 of them has been lamentable. I mean, the Chinese basically have a relationship with the Khartoum government which is like that, and they've supported the Khartoum government. They tried to block stronger international pressures through the Security Council because of their economic and political interests. The Russians sell vast amounts of military equipment to the Sudanese, and the Arab League has not said anything in the course of the 4 years of the conflict which has been critical of Khartoum. Indeed, the only thing the Arab League ever says on the question is to criticise the rebel group. So there needs to be deeper diplomatic engagement with all of these other actors with whom Europe has relationships to try and get Darfur and these other crises that we're going to talk about higher up the agenda. So when European leaders meet with Hu Jintao from China, they don't just discuss trading opportunities in China, they talk about Darfur and what leverage the Chinese can bring to bear on the Khartoum government. It seems to be extremely essential that we actually try and bring more of these other actors into the discussion and use our leverage and our influence and our diplomatic contacts with them to best effect. My fourth point is about military force. And it's to say that robust military force is sometimes necessary. I've already said I don't think non-consensual military intervention in Darfur will work. But there are other instances, notably Rwanda in 1994, where frankly anything else wouldn't have worked. You can have the best mediators in the world and the best sanctions and the best legal instruments, but in April 1994, unless you had troops on the ground that were equipped and mandated and able, frankly, to use force, then that genocide would have continued in the way that it did. So we need, I mean, this is difficult for me as someone who spent a lot of his life in the peace movement to say, but sometimes military force matters and it counts. And to save lives, you've actually got to be prepared to take lives. And that's a tough message to say, but it's something that people that are serious about civilian protection need to think about. And need to think about the way in which military forces can be equipped and mandated, the kind of rules of engagement that they have operating in these kind of environments. And there's evidence from the Sierra Leone case, and also I think from the DRC case, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that when more robust military force was used, when the British went into Sierra Leone and the French, after this European mission was deployed in the DRC, you actually got an improvement in relation to civilian security. So this is a complex issue, but we need to think about the kind of equipment and mandate and rules of engagement that troops have in these kind of cases. My fifth point, I'm probably overrunning my time, is about the absolutely critical importance of political solutions. Yes, there are interim measures that are sometimes appropriate. As an interim thing, I want to see a UN or a UN hybrid, AU hybrid force in Darfur, but the lasting solution to the people of Darfur, that lasting civilian protection can only come through a political settlement. So all of us need to redouble our efforts to find ways through to bring parties that haven't previously come to an agreement to find ways in which they can do that. That's the absolute precondition for more effective civilian protection in the longer term. And then the last point, which is possibly the precondition for everything else that I've said, and everything else we'll say in the course of the discussion, is political will. Now, we can talk a lot about capacity, and we can talk about systems and processes and institutions and arrangements, but ultimately, unless governments and key actors and institutions of the UN system, the AU, and governments that have influence are prepared to use that influence to best effect, then none of this will happen. So the question is how then do you generate political will? And I suppose that's where all of us come into it. civil society, people who are working on those issues, think tanks, academics, researchers, people like that are involved in those kind of debates and discussions have a role to play in presenting political leaders at all sorts of different levels with good arguments as to how they should act in particular cases, and good, solid, well thought through proposals as to how they should act. And so I think I'll end on that point, but a point about the critical role of civil society. When we talk about civilian protection and conflict and crisis in Africa, this isn't just a problem for people over there. It's something that we're all involved in, that we all have responsibilities for, and something that we can all make a contribution to.